Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you out there. Welcome to the first of what we hope will become a regular series of webinars on one of the hottest topics in international development and business sustainability. How do we engage business and how do we scale up collaboration to deliver the SDGs? My name is Darian Stibbe. I'm Executive Director of the Partnering Initiative, and we're delighted to bring you this webinar alongside our partner World Vision and in association with Business Fights Poverty and Together 2030. For those of you that don't know the Partnering Initiative, we're a non-profit based in the UK operating globally with the mission to unleash the power of partnership for development. For the last 13 years or so, we've worked at the forefront of developing the theory and practice of cross-sector collaboration. Our focus for the last couple of years has been on the topic of this webinar. How can we scale up? How can we mainstream collaboration as an essential mechanism to achieve the SDGs? I'm delighted to be joined in this discussion by three people with huge knowledge and experience of exactly this area. We have, or will shortly have when he's able to join us from a meeting that he's having right now with the Secretary General, we will have David Nabarro, who is the SG's Special Advisor on Agenda 2030, whose role is around galvanizing UN and country action on implementing the agenda and also oversees special initiatives of the SGs such as Every Woman, Every Child. Now, David coordinated the UN's response to the Ebola outbreak and was fundamental in driving forward the Scale Up Nutrition movement, which supports coordinated, much more systemic, multi-stakeholder action on nutrition at the country level. Jane Nelson is Director of the Corporate Social Responsibility Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Jane has worked in this field, I think, for nearly 25 years with the International Business Leaders Forum, with the UN, with the Clinton Global Initiative, with the University of Cambridge. I think with her cutting-edge thinking, her research, her writing, it's difficult to think of anyone who's done more to promote and influence the role of business as a positive force in development. I'm also delighted to welcome Trihadi Saptoadi from World Vision. Now, Trihadi has scoped every geographical level, working as a country director for World Vision for Laos and Indonesia, a regional leader for South Asia and Pacific, and now with World Vision International's global lead for impact and engagement. Trihadi has a reputation for innovation, for pioneering new approaches and cross-sector partnerships to transform the lives of the poorest. A very big welcome and a thank you to all of you. Before we get going, it's worth taking notes of how things have changed in international development. The SDGs are very different to the MDGs. Firstly, they inherently acknowledge the interconnectedness of the prosperity of business, the prosperity of society, and the prosperity of the environment. All societal sectors are considered as essential actors in development. And thirdly, a much more systems integrated approach is required to achieve sustainable change. And what does that mean? It means working across traditional development silos. It means working across the SDG goals. It also requires an unprecedented level of collaboration across societal sectors. Now, this is a heavy demand to place. Building trust, aligning interests, and partnering across societal sectors is hugely challenging. It won't just happen. It requires a targeted, systematic effort to make it happen. And this is the area that TPI has really been focusing on, and we see the need for action at multiple levels, from international policy through building infrastructure to really be able to catalyze and support collaborations, to ensuring that partnerships are built and operating to the highest standards to be able to deliver value. And also at the organizational level, that organizations themselves are set up to be able to partner effectively, and they have the right people with the right skills for partnering. Today, we're focusing on that essential question of the infrastructure, the platforms for collaboration, particularly at the country level. These platforms are essential to catalyze partnerships for the SDGs. And this is a subject that is the subject of a new report by World Vision and TPI, which is called Delivering on the Promise. And in a moment, I'm going to ask Trihadi to give us a bit of a flavor of the report to introduce this discussion. Now, just on a little bit of housekeeping, what we would very much welcome comments and questions at any point from the participants who are currently watching. And you will find a comments box, and in that, or a chats box, in that chat box, if you could please change it. At the moment it probably says comments to all panelists. You'll need to adjust it so that it's comments to everyone. And if you put your comments and your questions in there, then we will try and see how many of those we can get through during this webinar. So welcome again to all the panelists. As I said, David, we are hoping will be able to join us in a few minutes after he's finished his meeting with the Director General. In fact, welcome, David. You've just arrived exactly on time, as I was mentioning you. And we will be starting, as I said. Trihadi is going to just give us a little bit of a flavour of the World Vision TPI report. So, over to you, Trihadi.
Thank you so much for your introduction. I would like also to kind of introduce World Vision to participants that may not know World Vision. World Vision is a Christian child-focused relief, development, and advocacy organization dedicated to working with children, families, and communities to overcome poverty and injustice. We work in nearly 100 countries around the world. So welcome and thank you for joining this webinar. I am very honored and delighted to be a panelist today. No question that Agenda 2030 is a very important agenda for all of us. And it is an ambitious and bold agenda. We believe that business as usual approach in implementing the agenda will not deliver the transformation that is essential to reach zero target in areas such as preventable child death, hunger, and violence against children. We know that we cannot work alone or in silo. We are convinced that cross-sector partnership between organizations from different sectors of society have a huge role to play in delivering our promise to achieve the SDGs. But we have a good news. We see a growing cross-sector partnership and collaboration, including World Vision. We have been part of many consortia and partnership, but we need a more cross-sector partnership that are delivering at scale. Our biggest challenge now is how to scale up our impact. A multi-stakeholder platform, which are specially designed to catalyze collaboration, have an essential role to play in getting us to scale. The platform could provide a systematic approach to achieving this. We believe in multi-stakeholder collaboration. We have learned that this collaboration works and makes difference. I really believe, for instance, World Vision and the Partnering Initiative, we jointly developed a policy paper entitled Delivering on the Promise. It is our fourth in the last 2 years. Our investment is not limited to policy papers. We are increasingly, continuously walking the talk, entering into cross-sector partnership at all levels of our organization, from our local frontline program unit to global level. And we are working with a Partnering Initiative building a new platform. For example, a platform in Asia focused on WASH, water, sanitation, and hygiene, and a multi-stakeholder disaster management focused platform in East Africa. I would like to highlight three key areas which we believe could make difference to our effort to deliver our promise. Namely, first, integration. Second is delivering for the most vulnerable. And the third platform is leadership. Let me start first with the integration. We realize that none of the SDG can be tackled as a silo. The SDG are an interconnected and indivisible set of goals. And it is critical that cross-sector partnership and platform support integrated approaches. The slide there, thank you, Darian, for putting on the screen. The slide, it basically describes a system thinking view and observes that platform act like nodes within the wider complex web of interrelationship, which comprise a National Agenda 2030 system. Therefore, issue-focused platform must not only apply integrated approaches within their internal operation, but even more importantly, must also take a very intentional approach to external linkages to other platforms and structures within the system in which they operate. For example, we've been playing a leading role since the formation of the Global Baby Wash Coalition, which is forming national platforms to bring together actors from all sectors of society with a specific focus on integrating water, sanitation and hygiene, maternal and early childhood development for better health outcomes during the first 1,000 days of. Secondly, the paper explores how this platform can deliver for the most vulnerable. Agenda 2030 insists that not only effort be made to reach first those left farthest behind. In our partnership with businesses, we seek to bring an intentional focus on the most vulnerable children. For example, with Royal DSM, we partners among other joint projects to advocate together at key global movement on child malnutrition for the most vulnerable. We have recently signed a multi-layered partnership with MasterCard, which has a specific focus on digital identity and electronic payment technology, which are becoming increasingly critical to effectively reach the most vulnerable, including refugees. Platform for partnership must also include reaching the most vulnerable in their goals and objectives. It sounds very obvious, but it is not always the case for our current platforms. The third area that I would like to highlight today from the paper is that platform of leadership. Different models are in operation currently in national platforms, including leadership being provided by just one sector of the society. However, the paper strongly recommends a shared cross-sectors of society leadership model, including a central role for the government. This model is more appropriate for managing sensitive multi-stakeholders processes and is more likely to be able to nurture a safe, open collaborative space that encourages each other or each sector to contribute in a spirit of trust and openness. Interviewers on the whole also felt this model is a better able to deal with politics and power within platform, such as preventing and managing conflict of interest. We believe that government should play a central role in this shared leadership approach, given that government are the primary duty bearers for their country's development and can ensure that platform goals are aligned with country priorities. Let me conclude. First of all, encouragingly, we are seeing national platforms in many different forms, emerging from different stakeholders groups, either at the country level and also from global initiatives seeking to strengthen their national level implementation delivery system. And it's great to see the paper Delivering Our Promise explore how to avoid issues of overlaps and duplication between platforms. However, we also recognize that a multi-stakeholder collaboration is needed at a vastly increased scale, and there is a need for many more champions to drive this agenda forward. Champions, organizations, and individuals from different sectors of society who can make the case, cast a vision, and inspire action. Finally, we should also remember that partnership and platform are not an end in themselves. They are a means to an end. For World Vision, we are committed to play our part to support the realization of the hopes and dreams of millions of the most vulnerable children around the world, including those in the hardest place to reach. Agenda 2030 is a promise to those children, and World Vision will strive over the next 15 years to partner with others to ensure that together we deliver on the promise. Thank you so much. Back to you, Darian.
Trihadi, thank you very much indeed. That gives a wonderful framework for the discussion. Just to mention that people have been on the chat boxes already. There's a whole lot of really great comments. If you want to go to the chat section, you'll see them. David, we've just heard from Trihadi, and he talks about this issue of integration within a system. Now, a systemic approach, the SDGs in essence call for a systemic approach, but the challenge is, how do you actually do that on the ground? How do you get so many different actors, so many different stakeholders aligned in some way to achieve the real change that's required? Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about Sun's experience in doing exactly that.
David Nabarro here. My job is as Special Advisor to the United Nations Secretary General on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Climate. I've been doing this job since January. Before that, I was working on some public health issues, particularly Ebola, and I was responsible for the movement for scaling up nutrition. And I'd like to start where Trihadi left off, by really accentuating some of the points that you made, sir, about the aspects of the 2030 Agenda that challenge us to work in the way that we know is appropriate for development, and indeed that World Vision has championed for years. Firstly, working cross-sectorally, recognizing that so many of the issues that affect people are interconnected, and that separating them out because they suit our professions or our sectors or our specialisms is not necessarily helpful to people. Secondly, the universality of the 2030 Agenda that leads us to recognize that it just isn't reasonable to focus on one particular group of countries or people. This is an agenda that applies to everybody, and a lot of the issues in the 2030 Agenda represent public goods, particularly those to do with climate or public health. Thirdly, the focus on leaving no one behind, a point that you were very strong on in your remarks. Fourth, the value of integrated action when addressing these different challenges in the 2030 Agenda, which is where the notion of platform working, which is so well described in the paper, comes out. And then finally, this continued and important emphasis on multi-stakeholder working, which is at the center of the 2030 Agenda. Now, as I've been working with colleagues in the UN system on this and building on what we learned through the Sun movement, we've identified 5 features of platform working that we believe can be helpful. The first is that they do require new ways of thinking, new narratives, new ways of analyzing challenges, and new ways of thinking about the response, which is, as has come up in the chat, and also you said towards the end of your remarks, which is systemic rather than linear. And to teach people to think in systems terms, is quite challenging, given that so many have been educated in linear cause and effect thinking, but it has to be done. Secondly, new ways of acting. Now how do we behave? Well, if we're going to work on platforms and with multiple stakeholders, the most important requirement is to be in a situation where trust becomes the characteristic of all the different actors on the platform. And to build trust is not easy, it takes time, because you have to be both predictable and respectful in your behavior to others and they to you. And if trust is broken, it takes time to rebuild it. If trust is broken repeatedly, it cannot be rebuilt and the platform won't work. And that usually means that those who've broken the trust have to be invited to leave the platform so it can rebuild. And this issue of trust is fundamental in multi-stakeholder working. And if there is trust, that can be used to deal with potential conflicts. But you're less likely to get conflicts if you've got the trust, and trust will come if there is transparency. Transparency about what you're doing, but also transparency about your intentions. Third part is ways of engaging. If you're working in platforms, you have to be always open. Never start an activity just by working with one or two people and excluding others till you've hatched the plot, and bring others in once it's hatched. That's an absolute way to wreck the platform. Everybody has to be engaged from the start and part of the formation of the ideas and the agreement on what's going to be done. As soon as you get little factions inside a platform, it's a problem. And that's why when describing a platform, I always talk about big tents without walls. They can certainly have places where people can meet and organize, but no walls, so that they can be seen, so that people know what's going on, and they can always move and rearrange themselves. But the most important thing about the tent is that there's a big map in the tent and everybody knows where they're going. If they want to change direction, they change direction together. So a clear direction finder, you could call it a compass or a pole star, a big tent without walls, but places where people can come together and gather and mingle and network. Fourthly, communicating. When inside a platform, the really important thing is that people have got to leave their individual affiliations behind at the door. It doesn't mean that they lose their individual affiliations. That's why in Sun, we always refer to a movement. We're part of our individual organizations, but when inside the movement and working within the context of the movement, our primary loyalty is to the goal of the movement. So we leave our identities at the door. I often encourage people to take off their logos and not to promote their logos all the time. And certainly not to start discussions by saying, we in this organization take this point of view. Instead, to drop out their affiliations and talk about their common purpose. And that's really important in communicating more widely. And then lastly, reporting. You report on behalf of all, and you report in terms of what's achieved for the people you're trying to serve, rather than reporting about what you have done as your organization. So the focus is not on what we try to deliver, but on how people have benefited, what new access they've got. Some last comments quickly. I think that, as is in your paper, there is an increasing understanding that platform working matters. And the elements necessary for platform working that I've identified have their reflection in your paper. But I want to raise one other point. Our platforms are not islands. Our platforms are actually inside broad systems in society that are many other platforms, many other arrangements. And in fact, the more you study, the more you realize the incredible multifaceted complexity of society. And as soon as you see it as a set of systems, then understanding what you're working in, the context, gets quite interesting. I'm picking out 4 features of context that I'm trying to explore now with my colleagues. Feature 1, what is truth, what is knowledge within the context of broader systems in society? Is there absolute knowledge? Or is knowledge what is reflected in the minds and the hearts of the individual members of the system? I'm exploring this more and more, and increasingly feeling that knowledge is very much related to who's in the system rather than some absolute doctrine of facts. Number two, what does a system actually mean when you dissect it? And increasingly I'm saying it's not about the organizations that are represented, whether they're government or civil society or faith. It's the people, the networks of people and their characteristics and their relationships. Number 3 point relates to, inside those systems, what really matters in terms of trying to get alignment, and how can you do it? Answer, to understand the organizing principles of the systems. What is it that drives people to operate and behave in particular ways? And as we heard earlier on, what are the power relationships? And then working through that, seeking alignment through political action, rather than just through institutional tinkering or through intellectual argument. And then last point, very finish, all this leads us sometimes, I think, to question who we are and what we are in our work. And the notion that somehow we have some kind of authority as development professionals to exercise influence over others because of where we come from, how we've learned, what we've done, may not be the case. I certainly am in a phase of my life where I see myself as learning more and knowing myself, positioning myself as a servant within multiple systems and seeking, at least in myself, to find a place where I can be useful without necessarily finding a position for myself that casts me in any respect as different from any others. This notion of self-actualization, self-realization in this kind of work within the context of the 2030 Agenda, platforms and systems is something, a project I'm still working on. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much indeed. I think you have issued, in a sense, really quite a challenge, and many of the things that you were talking about actually have been coming up a little bit in the chat as well. This idea that, in fact, you talked about self-realization, but in general, a need that we need to be challenging the assumptions about existing development models, that actually we're talking about really quite fundamental shifts in the way that we do development. And the systemic approach is one that has not been delivered really significantly enough. Thinking has been too linear. And your discussions about the system being not necessarily organizations, but it's the networks of people and individuals who can really drive development collectively, I think is one that will resonate with many of the people listening today. Jane, you heard what David said, you heard what Trihadi said. Now, when it comes to business and the way that business thinks and operates, what will they make of what you've heard today? Is this a way that business can they understand and integrate into such a system? What are business incentives, and how can they work in these areas? How can they engage in platform if they want to?
Massive.
Thank you very much, Darian and David and Trihadi. It's wonderful to be here with you all as part of this community, I think, of, as you say, David, of shared learning and the recognition of how much we still have to learn. And I think in terms of the role of the private sector, it's useful. We often sort of think of businesses as monoliths and companies as institutions. And I think this point that businesses as well are clearly made up of people and individuals throughout companies, and finding ways to connect with those individuals very much along the lines that both David and Trihadi have spoken is really where we need to go. And I think, building on what the others have said, I think there's sort of three key reasons why I think business will be very interested in this new framework and wonderful report that World Vision and the Partnering Initiative have just shared with us. And I think the first is this crucial focus on the country level. because in many ways the country level has been the missing piece in the last sort of 10 years of us building partnerships for development. We've made wonderful progress, I think, in developing some very inspiring and continually important global platforms and global partnerships in health and education and food and agriculture. But for many local companies, whether they're sort of national or even smaller local companies, those global partnerships, they don't have the resources necessarily to get engaged at the global level. I mean, we need the global partnerships for agenda setting, but they might not be as inclusive of local NGOs, local companies as is needed. But then secondly, we've got thousands at this stage of project level sort of financing and implementation partnerships where one NGO is working with one company or a small group of companies are working. And again, we need a lot more of those. And I think one of the participants, I liked what he said, scale is important, but don't forget that many small steps help us to make large leaps. So we need those very local partnerships. That's where the implementation happens. But as I think it was Jesse Henshaw also said, lots and lots of disparate project partnerships often don't add up, or they can contradict each other, and they don't have the sort of systemic impact and the scale that is sometimes needed. So I think we still need the global partnerships and many, many local project-based partnerships, but these country-level platforms that you've described in your paper, I think give us enormous potential to have more systemic impact and scale at the country level. And they're focused enough in a particular country around a particular set of issues that business can get engaged and get their head around it. But they're also, I think, local enough that local companies, local NGOs can have a place at the table and get engaged. And I think a couple of people have asked, well, how do we get government involved? I think we're far more likely to sort of get government to the table and engage actively with government if we're doing it collectively, of business and the NGO community within a particular country, reach out to government collectively instead of all doing it on a one-on-one basis. So I think that's the sort of first point that I want to make from a business perspective, that while project level partnerships will continue to be important and some of the large companies can engage at the global level, these national platforms I think offer enormous potential for achieving greater scale and systemic impact than we could have otherwise. I think secondly, I really just want to re-emphasize the integration point that both Trihadi and David have made. I think the great thing about national level platforms, whatever lens you go in through, whether it's your women's empowerment or health and wellness or child protection, as you explained, Trihadi, it gives an opportunity to have a particular focus, but then think sort of much more systematically, well, what are the links with the other SDGs, and think in a more holistic, integrated way. And I think companies, on the one hand, want focus and they're good at focus, but these sort of platforms also then bring other points to the table. And I think we need to encourage everyone, including companies, to be more intentional, whatever the focus is, how that links with other development objectives and priorities. And then the third and final thing I'll say about how business can engage, I think these national level platforms give us a great opportunity to enable business to engage in different ways. I think there's been a bit of a tendency recently to say it's all got to be about the core business and not about philanthropy anymore. And yet, some companies will be able to use their social investment, their philanthropy, their employee volunteers. Others will want to build inclusive business models and engage through their core business. Others will want to get involved in policy dialogue. And I think sort of national platforms give an opportunity for business to engage in different ways. And so they both allow for collective action and a more systemic approach, but also flexibility in the ways that companies engage. So those are sort of be my three starting comments. I think this focus at the country level is very important, and the opportunity to bring in local companies, local civil society organizations is critical. The ability to integrate across the different SDGs, and then thirdly, the fact that we should draw on all the different ways that business can engage and not sort of get caught into silos that it has to be core business or it has to be philanthropy.
Thank you so much, Jane. So yes, a call certainly for flexibility on that side. I like your expression about being more intentional And the idea that there are these thousands of different individual projects going on, but if we can somehow, to use David's expression, have the polar star that can somehow align these better, then we can then hopefully achieve far more systemic change. And Jane, you mentioned government, and it's coming up a couple of times in this chat as well. So this is now a question for all on government, and perhaps it's something of a concern about government in two possible ways. One is that government does not have the capability, the capacity to run these platforms, possibly not even in some countries, the legitimacy or the level of trust with other actors to be able to run these platforms was one concern. The second concern was in essence around power. And if governments are running these platforms, then the risk is that everything is around government. Government calls the tune. So I guess the question is, who should be leading these platforms? Is it really government, as the report says, or do we need much stronger multi-stakeholder governance here?
Do you want me to respond?
Please do, Jane.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, and David made the point. I think governance is absolutely critical in these partnerships, and particularly I think the sort of the platform initiatives. My view, I veer towards the multi-stakeholder approach, but with a very clear link between any platform and the government's national strategy, and making sure that they're key government people as part of the governance framework. But I think the governance framework is the point David made about having a governance framework which is transparent, which is accountable first and foremost to the vulnerable and the communities and the people who are mostly the focus of these partnerships, but also accountable to the partners. So I think the governance piece is critical, and the structure of the governance is critical. But at the end of the day, regardless of how the governance is structured, as long as it's sort of transparent and accountable, I think the most important thing are the individuals and the individual leadership skills and capabilities of all of the participants, whether it's the business participants, the government participants, the NGOs, sort of spokespeople for low-income communities. And here I think we have both incredible opportunity, but also responsibility to look at how we can have more shared learning around what does it mean to be a systems leader, and whether you're coming from the business perspective or you're in a government ministry. David talked about learning and listening. How do we move away from the sort of expert-driven technical approach, which we need? Because we need water experts, we need health experts, we need the technical expertise still in all sectors. But how do we bring people who have that technical expertise from government, from civil society, from business, and build skills that are around listening and learning, thinking across traditional boundaries, and working in a much more holistic, collective way. So I think the combinations of good governance structures and a really relentless focus on building your individual leadership capabilities to be systems leaders, and focus on the individuals involved is very important. And that government ministers and government civil servants are as important in that as anyone.
Thanks, Jane. I think you've written a great paper on system leaders, particularly around platforms in agriculture. And I think the point that systems leaders can come from any sector as well. It's not just from government; it can come from the NGOs. It can actually come from business. You also talked about the capabilities, the shared learning that needs to come from these platforms. David, what's your take on the leadership that's going to be required in country, and the role of government, and in your case, the role of the UN? What is the UN's role in these platforms?
Thanks very much indeed. So I was really interested in everything that Jane said, because it was exceedingly practical and helpful to me. And I was also interested in some of the chat that's coming through, which is commenting on this. So it has led me to think about leadership for this new way of working. I've also been thinking a bit about the practicality of advancing it. And so it's great that you asked me that second question about the UN. On leadership, I'm increasingly of the view that to stimulate and sustain the kind of platforms that are described in the policy paper, and then to advance platforms so that they can address the challenges in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, leadership needs to be dispersed and not in the hands of a small number of individuals, because it only works if there is trust. And then if through that trust comes a set of practices that everybody on the platform or around the platform agrees to adopt. And those practices are not going to be imposed as you get in a more standard organization from a boss at the top. They are taken on by mutual consent among the practitioners. And so that means that although it's a little bit out of fashion at the moment, a dispersed pattern of leadership is key, where there is mutual accountability amongst everybody. And sometimes the very best people at holding the community together are not those who would necessarily be identified as the spokespeople or the people with most of the ideas, but they may be the caretakers of the arrangements of the platform, and in the end they might be the most important people of all. I have actually just coincidentally been going through this. There's a big changeover happening at the top of one UN organization today. A deputy is leaving, and that deputy probably has had more influence, not just in her own organization, but in a much wider collective of actors working in development and humanitarian action than could possibly be explained in any simple analysis, because she has been the caretaker of good practice in partnering. So it's that function that increasingly I perceive to be super important. I'm sorry to be going on so long. Secondly, on the UN, we are a collective of organizations that were set up in response to a perception that the way you do development was to be very sectorally subdivided. We have specialized agencies that are governed by sectoral ministers, for example, agriculture governing the Food and Agriculture Organization, or technology governing the International Telecommunications Union, or labor ministers governing the International Labour Organization. So we are constitutionally stovepiped with governance structures that are stovepiped, and with governors who have a terrible habit of saying, you must be more focused, and you must work less at interfaces, and you must have less overlap, otherwise you're wasting money. So, and then they chop budgets. So it's really a very difficult environment within which to build a more horizontal way of working across the interfaces. And because we're not working for one set of governors, but we're working for 193, it's particularly complicated. If one group of governors say, yes, be more horizontal, the other group might say no. So we have to do some very clever things now, and we're involved in it, to enable us to get our owners to actually let us start to move ahead and work in the different ways. I think we've got some very good features that help us do this. Our resident coordinator system is designed for horizontal working, and it's increasingly designed for open working. And so the people supporting our resident coordinators are working very hard at this, and I hope they can be useful. And in that regard, the whole UN development system has become much more horizontal than ever before. But we've still got some work to do on other parts, and that's something that I'm involved in on a quite regular basis, together with many others here, particularly the leaders of some of the agencies that you know well. Thanks.
So I think your point, David, is the challenge of having multiple masters who are basically the ones funding this work is a point that's also coming up a lot in the chat. And I guess a question for you, Trihadi, is that the current development system has donors, in many cases, donors providing funding to NGOs to deliver specific programs. And actually that sort of funding makes it very, very difficult to move out of the silos of the programs that you're delivering. It's very difficult to find, as somebody put it in the chat, to find anyone willing to fund the process of collaboration, which might eventually achieve far greater goals, far greater impact than these individual programs. Do you think, Trihadi, that it is within the current system of funding, how can NGOs possibly collaborate much more strongly on more systemic level, given the focus of the particular funds they receive?
Very, very difficult question, Darian. Thank you so much. Before I respond to your question, Darian, let me respond and appreciate Jane and David for their comment, especially for Jane on how actually different sectors can work together really well. And for David, I really appreciate the words that he used for all this conversation around characters, relationship, mindset, communication, trust. Those kind of challenge for us actually in development. It's often those words that actually represent why development is so difficult. So thank you, David. It's really kind of fresh, listening that word come from you. Then back to your question about that resources for partnership, resources for ensuring the process, how we can get resources that how donors can really look into it. Your question, I say, is really difficult because that also relates to our intent to reach the most vulnerable. I think that would be really why it's difficult. If we would like to make sure that the most vulnerable are not left behind, there are a lot of kind of software, I call it software, that require resources too. Listening to the poor, listening to the vulnerable groups require a process on the ground. Technology may help them, but you may also need face-to-face engaging with them directly. You have to go family to family, door to door, listening to the most vulnerable, and let alone set up a social accountability. That also require resources. It's, from a vision perspective, often it's much easier to get funding for constructing water pipelines or feeding children or building school. But doing a really effective social accountability, engaging with the poor so that we can listen to their voices, that's not easy. That's difficult because often donors will not see that result. So I think we need to start how to build that common understanding that when you go back to all this development and go back what David said about communication, relationship, build trust, that require change of behavior and mindset. And that require, I think, a different funding stream, different new generation of supporters and donors, and new understanding about our development. I hope that answers your question, Darian.
I think it very well demonstrates the challenges that we face, and on that there's a couple of other sort of comments from the chat, which is also saying that the topics or the subjects of these platforms to date are basically based on the funders who are willing to fund them. I guess the question is then, how can we do that? How can we widen understanding of these platforms as an essential mechanism, and how do we convince donors, governments, maybe companies to be able to fund these platforms? David or Jane, do you have a feeling? Or let's start with Jane. I mean, are companies ever going to be willing to contribute funding to these levels of these types of platforms outside of their immediate business interest?
No. I mean, I think obviously a very, very fair question, Darian, and I think some are, but not nearly enough. So let me preface by saying I absolutely agree that this role of facilitators, intermediaries, backbone organisations is critical, and the capacity of local and national NGOs, cooperatives, trade unions to engage on an equal basis is critical, and both of those need capacity building. And so I think, and I maybe encourage the Partnering Initiative and World Vision, to do you've already done a lot of work on this, but specifically focus on how can we fund and support that type of capacity building. And I think there's a role here definitely for companies, and we've seen it, the New Vision for Agriculture, some of the scaling up nutrition partnerships, where there's definitely a core group of companies that are willing to invest in the infrastructure and the sort of the institutional capabilities and make a long-term commitment to it. But they're particularly at the investing in the intermediary organisations, but maybe not so much on the capacity building of the NGOs and the cooperatives and trade unions, etc., to engage on an equal basis. But so I think we need to encourage more companies to make those investments, and we can do that by showing exactly why those investments are important and needed, and that they are needed over a long term. But I do think, in addition to companies, there's an enormous role and responsibility for both UN agencies, development finance institutions, bilateral agencies, to do more thinking about what's required for the institutional relationship infrastructure that is so increasingly critical to sort of locally driven, nationally determined development. And then thirdly, I think large foundations, and some of the large philanthropic foundations do understand this, but not enough are committing to that, both the institutional strengthening and the individual capacity building for partnerships. So I think a call to action for the philanthropic foundations, donors and companies is needed. And if one can show exactly how they can do it and examples where it's happening, and then how it makes the difference by having much more equal relationships and capabilities at the table, we could hopefully mobilize more support for capacity building of both the intermediary entities and as well as individuals in sectors which don't always have the same resources that government and business has.
So the need for resources to both support the intermediary organisations and then support the organisations to be able to come to the table and have the skills and capabilities to be able to take a full part in these collaborations and partnerships.
We're investing in leadership skills and people. Sorry, David.
No.
Yes. Indeed, to build the leadership capability of these people to drive these collaborations forward.
Darian, I wanted just to jump in, partly because I wanted to really support what Jane just said. It's really, really important. And secondly, because unfortunately I've just been told I've got to slip away, for which I apologise, in 3 minutes. First of all, I think all who've been involved in platform building and multi-stakeholder working know that building trust and establishing ways of working together takes time. And secondly, that even when you've got the platform, you can't assume that everything is going to move ahead nicely, because there will be disputes. That is the nature of platform working. And sometimes the disputes are important and need to be allowed to run their course. So there will be a community of people who understand this, and there's another community that get very frustrated and say, this is all talking and we just need to get on and do stuff. And they don't understand that partnering and platform working means having space within which people can come together and not feel rushed to do something, especially if they don't agree. So I think the value that can come out of the work that's described in this paper, and it's in there, is putting on the table the reality that patient capital is needed to let these things happen, and that if you're a development organization or a company or a government, you have to be ready to put that capital in. Obviously, it can't be completely unrestricted. You've got to put some time limits and performance indicators on it, but at the same time, it is needed. And here I'm sitting next to a colleague from the Global Compact, and Jane knows this, that the new leadership of the Global Compact is understanding this and is factoring it into their work. And I saw a discussion mentioned the partnership exchange. I hope these kinds of issues will come up in the partnership exchange at the high-level political forum at the end of next month. So with that, please, can I be kept in touch? I think there are some particularly interesting ideas on leaving no one behind, which we could also continue to talk about over time. But in the meantime, I'd just like to thanks very much for the chance to be here.
David, thank you very much indeed. In fact, the timing works out very well. I'm just going to ask Trihadi and Jane just to sort of give a minute's reflection from what they've heard on this webinar, and then we'll close. Trihadi, can I ask you first?
Thank you, Darian. David, sign off concluded really well. I look into trust, communication, but also, understanding and expectation of the reality. I think development is complex. Reaching out the most vulnerable is challenging for us, and understanding those are critical to build trust, openness, and transparencies. I think it's somehow the new generation will see that private sectors and civil society, NGO, all those boundaries is a blur now, right? I think we can create a new ways that all those different sectors can work together without see the big wall there. So I think the platform, the paper kind of encourage us to look at, to be much more transparent to each other and see that as a one unity of the society. Thank you so much, Darian.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead, Jane.
Thanks very much. I just want to strongly reinforce what both David and Trihadi have said, and I think my closing comment would be, as we look towards Agenda 2030 and working together to achieve the SDGs, there's no doubt we need large amounts of money. We do need a lot of technical expertise and technical skills and capabilities, but fundamentally this is going to succeed or fail on the basis of the quality of our relationships. And our relationships at the global level, at the project level, and certainly it's sort of through country level platforms. And I think these themes that come through again and again today are first and foremost mutual respect. There's secondly mutual responsibility and accountability for results. And then thirdly and finally sort of a mutual sense of possibility for what we can achieve together. And I think balancing that sense of possibility and excitement of what we can do together with a really strong focus on listening, learning, mutual respect, and mutual responsibility and accountability for results need to be the principles underpinning how we work together. And I do think these country level platforms are one of the areas that we really should do more work on and focus on as we go forward. And so thank you again to Trihadi, you and your colleagues at World Vision and Darian at the Partnering Initiative for giving us a pragmatic and practical framework as a basis of discussion, and look forward to continuing the conversation online with many of the great comments that have come in during the course of it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jane. Thank you very much indeed to all of our panelists and everyone who has tuned in. I think we're at the beginning of a discussion on this. I think that these platforms are becoming a new wave, a new approach to supporting the systemic type of development that we need. We need all organizations, all sectors to be working together to achieve the SDGs, and platforms as a mechanism, I think, will be expanding and scaling if we can get all those elements in place that we've heard today. So with that, I'd like to just mention that all the comments and all the links that are in the comments, we will happily share to everyone who took part. And thank you all very much.